the woman who recorded the governor. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 1991. In some American states, power is not hidden. He shows off. He builds monuments. He gives interviews. He smiles for the cameras. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, early 1990s. For decades, the state's politics had been shaped by a peculiar tradition, a mixture of public charisma, networks of private favors, and a public tolerance for scandals that, elsewhere in the country, would have ended entire careers. It was a culture that even had an informal name among journalists, the politics of spectacle. Leaders who divided the electorate between adoration and contempt, and who, one way or another, remained in power. Her name, for the purposes of this story, was Marion Delacroix. In some American states, power is not hidden. He shows off. He builds monuments. He gives interviews. He smiles for the cameras. And what she heard, over the course of months, through the thin walls of a meeting room. She decided that the state of Louisiana needed to hear it too. To understand this story, you need to understand one thing about Louisiana. It was, and in many ways still is, a place where politics is intertwined with entertainment. State governors were often charismatic figures, gifted orators capable of turning a budget speech into a spectacle. They were loved by some, hated by others, and rarely forgotten by anyone. This culture had a dark side. The line between politics as it's done and corruption was, for many within the system, a thin one, and often crossed without major consequences. State contracts, for road construction, for the operation of newly legalized casinos, for public health services, passed through hands that decided, based on personal relationships and accumulated favors, who won and who lost. The governor in this story, we'll call him Governor Beaumont, was to the public an almost mythical figure. He had governed the state for more than one non-consecutive term. He was remembered for his catchy phrases, his grandiose promises, and an energy that seemed inexhaustible even after decades in politics. For those who worked closely with him, there was a different version. A man who treated the state budget as an extension of his own interests, who rewarded loyalty with contracts, who saw questioning not as part of the democratic process but as personal betrayals. Marion Delacroix had worked in the anteroom of his office for 11 years. Her desk was a few meters from the governor's private meeting room, a room with walls that, as she would later describe them, seemed thick but weren't. Over the years, Marion had heard things, fragments of conversations, laughter after phone calls that ended with phrases like, "It's a done deal then," or "Send the check the usual way." For years, she did nothing about it, partly because she had no proof, partly because, as she would later say, everyone knew and nobody did anything, so why should I be any different? Until one specific name started appearing far too frequently. The secretary, Marion Delacroix. Who was this woman? Marion Delacroix was born in 1948 in a small town north of Baton Rouge. The daughter of an electrician and a seamstress, she was the first in her family to finish high school and get an office job, an achievement that, for her family, represented decades of effort concentrated in a single generation. She had joined the state civil service in 1979 as a typist. In 1981, she was promoted to executive secretary in the governor's office, a position that survived 3 different administrations, because Marion was known for a rare quality in any political environment. She didn't have her own agenda. She simply did the job, did it well, and went home. She had been a widow since 1987. Her husband, James Delacroix, had worked at the same oil refinery for 22 years before dying of respiratory complications, a condition that years later would be linked by medical studies to prolonged exposure to certain industrial chemicals without adequate protection. The name that was repeated, Bristol Engineering. Starting in 1990, Marion began to notice a pattern. One name appeared repeatedly in the governor's diaries, in incoming phone calls, in meetings scheduled with little notice and without formal registration in official calendars. Bristol Engineering and Construction. Bristol was a mid-sized company, based in New Orleans, that had been founded only 4 years earlier. In its first year of operation, it had received a modest state contract for renovations on a secondary highway. In 1990, Bristol had received state contracts totaling more than $18 million, including a contract to renovate a major stretch of Interstate 10, beating out companies with decades of experience and much more robust track records. Marion wasn't an engineer, she wasn't an auditor, but she had typed budget reports for over 10 years, and she knew when a number didn't make sense within the pattern of the others. What bothered her most, however, was not the numbers. It was the sound. One night in October 1990, Marion had stayed late to finish overdue reports. It was almost 8 o'clock at night. Most of the floor was empty. The governor was in a meeting with two men whom Marion recognized, executives from Bristol. The door to the room wasn't completely closed. She wasn't spying, at least not at first. But the voices carried in the empty hallway, and there was one phrase, just one phrase, spoken in the tone of someone closing an informal deal that Marion couldn't help but overhear. 20% as always, you know where to send it. Marion sat motionless for what she would later describe as the longest time in my life, probably 30 seconds. The following morning, she went to an electronics store on Florida Boulevard. Annie bought a small voice recorder. The decision, the weight of an illegal choice. Before proceeding, it's important to understand something about what Marion was considering doing because it wasn't simple, and it wasn't without legal risks for herself. Louisiana, like most American states, allowed one party involved in the conversation to record conversations without needing the other party's consent, a rule known as single-party consent. But Marion wasn't part of the conversation she intended to record. She worked in the anteroom. Recording conversations she wasn't participating in a government office, raised far more complex legal questions about privacy, misuse of state property, and the boundaries between legitimate whistleblowing and invasion of privacy. What changed, as she would later recount, was not a dramatic event. It was a simple conversation with her brother Daniel during a Sunday dinner. What changed, as she would later recount, was not a dramatic event. It was a simple conversation with her brother Daniel during a Sunday dinner. If you knew something wrong was happening and did nothing, could you sleep peacefully for the rest of your life? Between January and March 1991, Marion recorded 6 conversations. Her technique was simple and risky. When she knew of a scheduled meeting with executives from Bristol or other companies that received contracts under similar circumstances, she would leave her bag with the recorder turned on inside on a chair in the anteroom, close enough to the meeting room door to capture some of the audio. Not all the recordings were clear. Many contained only noise, muffled voices, and incomprehensible passages. But 3 of the 6 recordings contained segments in which it was possible to identify, with sufficient clarity, the governor's voice discussing payment terms that did not correspond to any official state budget process. One of the recordings, the most significant one, captured a conversation in which the governor was directly negotiating, with an intermediary from Bristol, the terms of a commission on a future bridge maintenance contract, which had not yet been publicly announced. It was proof that contracts were being decided even before they officially existed, with a percentage already agreed upon for the governor's circle. In April 1991, Marion had in her possession 3 cassette tapes with recordings that she knew could be explosive, but she also knew she had no idea what to do with them. Taking it to the FBI seemed like the obvious course of action. But Marion rightly feared that a federal investigation could take years, during which her identity could be exposed and her life turned upside down, with no guarantee of any outcome. That's when she remembered a report she had read months earlier, a series of articles about suspicious state contracts written by a Times-Picayune journalist named René Fontenot. Marion called the newspaper from a public phone. She didn't give her name. She only said she had information about government contracts and asked if she could meet with the journalist somewhere discreet. René Fontenot accepted immediately, without hesitation. The meeting took place at a roadside diner in Denham Springs, about 30 minutes from Baton Rouge, far enough away to reduce the risk of them being recognized. René Fontenot was 36 years old and had covered state politics for over a decade. She had received dozens of anonymous tips throughout her career, most of them unfounded. But there was something in Marion's tense voice on the phone that made her drive to Denham Springs without a second thought. Marion placed the shoebox on the table. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she opened it. "I work in the governor's office," she said, "for 11 years. And I need someone to hear this, because I can't carry this burden alone any longer." Renee spent the following weeks doing what investigative journalists do, obsessively verifying every detail that could be independently confirmed. She cross-referenced the dates of the recordings with public records of the governor's meetings, many of which were not listed on any official agenda, which was revealing in itself. She checked Bristol Engineering's contracts in the state's Department of Transport archives. She confirmed that the bridge maintenance contract mentioned in the most significant recording had, in fact, been publicly announced 6 weeks after the date of the recording, and awarded to Bristol without significant competition. The voice in the recording was analyzed by a forensic audio expert, hired confidentially by the newspaper, who confirmed that the probability of the voice belonging to anyone other than the governor was extremely low. Renee took the material to her editor-in-chief. The decision to publish wasn't made overnight. It involved the newspaper's lawyers, weeks of legal review, and a question that hung over the entire newsroom. How do you protect the source of a recording that technically could have been obtained illegally? In June 1991, the Times-Picayune published the first of a series of 4 reports based on what the newspaper described as recordings obtained by a source with direct access to the state executive office. The newspaper did not reveal Marion's identity, neither in the publication nor in subsequent years. The editorial decision was to protect the source at all costs, even under later legal pressure. The report included transcripts of excerpts from the recordings, including the phrase that had, months earlier, paralyzed Marion at her desk. 20% as always. You know where to send it. It was the first time in the state's recent history that the public had heard, in the governor's own words, the exact mechanics of how contracts were decided. The reaction was immediate and divided, revealingly insightful about the state's own political culture. For a segment of the population, the report confirmed what many had suspected for years, that state contracts were, in fact, decided behind closed doors, in exchange for payments that never appeared in any official balance sheet. For another group, including longtime political allies of the governor, the report was viewed with skepticism. Some questioned the authenticity of the recordings, some claimed that excerpts might have been edited out of context, and some simply argued that this is how politics has always worked here, and nobody ever cared before. The governor vehemently denied it. He called the report a political fabrication and a cowardly attack based on illegal recordings obtained by an anonymous trader. Despite the denials, the publication had an effect that no denial could undo. It gave the FBI a concrete lead to open an investigation that, according to internal records revealed years later, had already been under consideration for some time, but without sufficient evidence to justify the necessary resources. Despite the denials, the publication had an effect that no denial could undo. It gave the FBI a concrete lead to open an investigation that, according to internal records revealed years later, had already been under consideration for some time, but without sufficient evidence to justify the necessary resources. What investigators found confirmed, on a much larger scale, what Marion's recordings had suggested: a system of informal commissions on state contracts that, according to estimates by the FBI itself, could have diverted between $15 and $25 million over several years. Marion Delacroix left her job in the governor's office in August 1991, 2 months after the publication, a decision she would describe as inevitable, although no one in the office knew at the time that she was the source. She moved to a smaller house near her brother Daniel. She got an administrative job at a public school, quieter, more anonymous. For years, she never publicly confirmed that she was the source of the recordings. When asked decades later why she had waited so long to come out publicly, she replied with the same simplicity that had marked her entire life. "I didn't do it to become famous. I did it because if I didn't, I would continue hearing that phrase for the rest of my life." The criminal proceedings against the governor and executives of Bristol Engineering have dragged on for more than 3 years, including investigations, indictments, appeals, and postponements. Marion's recordings, while they couldn't be used directly as primary evidence due to legal questions about how they were obtained, served as what investigators would call a map, pointing out exactly where to look, which accounts to examine, which contracts to question. In 1994, after a trial that lasted 11 weeks, 2 Bristol engineering executives were convicted of fraud and bribery. The intermediary identified in the recordings pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, in part for cooperating with the prosecution. The governor, for his part, was never criminally convicted. The direct evidence against him, without the original recordings, which remained in the newspaper's possession and were never formally incorporated into the case, was deemed insufficient by the jury. The governor completed his term. He would not run for re-election, but he would remain an influential public figure in the state for more than a decade, giving interviews, participating in events, and being treated by many as a political legend, despite everything. For Marion and for Renee, the outcome was bittersweet. The system had been exposed. 2 executives had been convicted. Millions of dollars in future contracts were now subject to more rigorous audits. But the man whose voice had been recorded saying 20% as always never answered for it in court. The truth had been revealed, justice only partially. There are corruption stories that end with spectacular arrests, definitive headlines, and the villain clearly punished. This is not one of those stories, and perhaps that's exactly why it matters. Because most corruption in the real world doesn't end in spectacular convictions. It ends in partial truths, in slightly reformed systems, in men who continue to be applauded. What doesn't change, what never ceases to matter, is the individual choice of a person who decided they could no longer live with the silence. Marion Delacroix never wanted to be remembered as a heroine. She continued living her discreet life, close to her brother, away from the cameras, until her death in 2009. But somewhere in an archive, in some newspaper, there's a cassette tape with an 8-word phrase that a 43-year-old secretary decided the world needed to hear. Not every revealed truth changes the entire world, but all truth revealed. It changes the person who revealed it, and that in itself is something. For all those who heard something through a door, and they had to decide what to do with it.